And we're very, very pleased to have Mary Işın here. The whole thing has kicked off with a wonderful array of sweetmeats. Is that the right word? Sort of sweetmeats. Ottoman, modern Turkish, bit of a mixture.
Yes.
I think the idea was perhaps that we had them afterwards, but somehow it's all gone. It's all gone, which is a very good thing to have happened. Now, I think if those of you who received the program will have noticed that Mary is really an old Turkish hand, has been in Turkey for many, many years, since 1973, and has been, well, you have been a translator of many books. From Turkish into English, to do with archaeology.
Yes, always art, history, archaeology, that
culture
kind of thing.
and history. And then in 1983 you started getting interested in Ottoman and Turkish cuisine.
Yes.
Now, did you really learn the Ottoman script?
Well, I can read Ottoman cookery books.
In the old script?
Yes, but I can't read literature if it's very sort of heavy things. But when it's,
the
recipes.
The Arabic
yes,
script.
Yes.
I don't know if there are any Turks here who can do that. I doubt it very much.
But now people are more interested in it.
Yeah. So since '83 you have been researching Ottoman cuisine, and you've produced a book called The Turkish Kitchen.
Yes, that was the first.
The first one. And is this the second one, or are there others in between?
Yes, I did a transcription of an Ottoman cookery book dated 1900. That was published in 1998, and then a transcription of a food dictionary, which is a very interesting.
That's now available, or will become available.
No, that's well. The food dictionary was written by an Ottoman historian around 1800. That was a transcription, but then I wrote Ottoman food terminology. It's an encyclopedic dictionary. So that's available. That's sort of interesting, but it's only in Turkish.
Okay, so it's a very scholarly approach to Turkish food.
Yeah, that's what that's my sort of thing. I enjoy that.
Yeah. And well, your latest magnum opus is Sherbet Spice, of which we tasted some.
Yes.
And may I then leave it to you to take us through?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm very happy to be here and see so many people interested in the history of Turkish sweets, or Turkish sweets in general, and I think especially English, how English people love sweets. I don't know, I'm an English person, I love sweets and puddings, and in Turkey people love sweets and puddings, and it's a very important part of the culture. So it just sort of fits, English and English people and Turkish people together. And the main thing about the Turkish confectionery is that there's so many roots. So going back, to the Assyrians, in fact, who were in Assyria, which isn't Turkey, but they had an influence on their culture, and they were, for them, honey was very important. It was something sacred. And the Hittites, and the Central Asia, because the Turks came from Central Asia, and there's the Romans and the Arabs and the Persian cuisine, and they all have an influence, and then the Balkans and ancient Greece. So it's very rich culture with many influences and roots, and as a result, the Turkish sweets are really. It's not just because I live in Turkey that I'm saying this, but the variety is really extraordinary, very extraordinary. Not just sort of tarts and then millions of varieties on tarts, or like a cake, a million sort of varieties on cakes, but really completely different things. And the variety, I think, exceeds any other country in the many different types. Like there's quite a few things that are virtually unique to Turkey alone, or just to one or two other countries. And some that I've talked to people experts on Arab cuisine, and they say, "Oh, we don't have that." But here you have in Turkey you sort of have everything anyway, and I think Islam also has an effect, because the development of sugar was in Persia, and that sugar culture and sugar refining went to the Arab countries. And then there's these two sayings of the Prophet, but I talked to a theologian and he says they're apocryphal. So when somebody invented it, I don't know, but there's two of them, and you can hear it many times in Turkey. They say loving sweets is an article of faith, is one of them, and the other one is the faithful are like helva, which just means anything sweet. And so at some point, it became so important that they attributed these things to the Prophet, although it's not actually a genuine saying of the Prophet. And there's so many cultural aspects to sweets, like, of course, in many countries too, but in Turkey, there's when you're born, there's sweets, you get married, there's sweets, you get engaged, there's sweets, you die, there's sweets. Ramazan comes around, it's sweets, and then Muharrem comes around, again, it's sweets. And in the past, it was even more, like when children went to school, you gave sweets to the teacher, things like that. Or when journeymen became masters, so they had a ceremony. So the craftsmen had a big party and they had a ceremony. There, again, sweets came into it. And so the first picture I have, where's the button? Yeah. This is a float in a procession. In 1582, it's a circumcision procession for the Sultan's son, Mehmet III, before he was Sultan. And this is a float pulled through the streets. Like, I don't know, in Nottingham there used to be a festival, they used to have floats. And this is the sugar makers and the confectioners showing they've got their rows of sugar loaves and jars with presumably sweets in. And they also have a parrot, which is sort of curious. And the parrot was supposed to love sweets, and in Mevlana''s poetry he mentions the parrot many times as sort of being sweet-tongued or loving sweets, and it's a symbol for spiritual awareness. So there's one example, because Mevlana is very sort of common to find, but there's another one. This is an Ottoman poet called Ahmet Pasha, who died in 1497, and he said in one of his poems, "He is a parrot desirous to reach the place where sugar is found." So it's you're searching for spiritual awareness or love of God, and you're likened to a parrot. So I think that the symbol of the confectioners was the parrot. Actually, there's no documentary evidence, but it's very curious that in this picture they have a parrot. They're carrying a parrot along with them, and these are sugar gardens, and it was common at weddings or circumcisions. Of course, either very rich people or the royal family, they had these sugar gardens which made by confectioners. And so you can see these two are from 1720, and they have little pools with boats on them, and the pools apparently had sherbet in them, and the soil was made of musk and sugar mixed together, and the apples were made of marzipan on the trees, that kind of thing. So they had these beautiful gardens that were paraded through the streets, and then either they took them back to the palace and the people in the palace and broke them up and ate them, or they let the crowds sort of scramble for them and break them up and eat them. And they had this records for this for the 15th century as well, for Mehmet, Fatih Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror, his sons. They had sugar mosques, castles, pavilions, and meadows of flowers. And the pebbles were sugared almonds. And then they also had sugar animals, statues of animals, that they carried through. And they have many different kinds. You can find foreign texts where they describe all the different animals. So you had ostriches and camels and ducks and lion cubs and lions and all kinds. So here I just blew up one row here to show there's a leopard and a panther, maybe, I'm not quite sure, or maybe it's a tiger and a leopard, anyway, and camel, and that's that some sort of mythical creature. I can't remember what they call it, but anyway. And so they carried these through the streets, and again, then the people would be allowed. They just would let the crowds come and eat them up, break them up, and eat them. And they also had things like chess sets and backgammon sets made of sugar as well in these kind of processions. Like in 1675, the British chaplain, Dr. Covell, and he wrote a wonderful diary about his 7-year stay in Turkey. And actually it's very sad because this diary has only been published in the 19th century, just in little extracts. And in fact the diary is, when I went to the British Library to look at it a few years ago, in fact it's 4 volumes, and there's incredible stuff in it, and I've been trying for years to get somebody to take it on. It really needs publishing. It's just been sitting there, you know, for 300 years, and only sort of maybe a fifth of it has actually been published, less probably. And he's very a fun, open-minded person. Makes good reading. And he describes when he saw a procession like this, and he saw ostriches, peacocks, swans, pelicans, lions, bears, greyhounds, deer, horses, elephants, rams, and buffaloes. And now, this is Ashure. It's a pudding made of basically whole wheat grains, boiled. It's like the English flummery, which is apparently, until very recently, it was known, still remembered in the north of England and Scotland. And they also have it in China and in Cuba. I've heard of it from many places, variations on it. So this is something very ancient, which spread out with the beginning of farming throughout the world by Neolithic peoples. And they just made a sort of a porridge or just a soup out of the whole wheat grains. But the point of the whole wheat grains was, in fact, in the book called The Golden Bough by Fraser, which is about folklore in all around the world, but basically England. And he gives a quote from a poem by Robert Burns, and it's called John Barleycorn. And he said, two of the lines are, "But a miller used him worst of all, for he crushed him between 2 stones." So it's actually the god of the corn, or the god of fertility, and when you grind it in the mill, you're torturing the god who's not going to be happy, and then you're not going to get a good harvest the next year. So that's the point of the whole wheat grains. So the rest of the year you do that, but for one festival you show the god of the corn that, you know, you want to be nice to him. So this is a very, very ancient pudding, but of course it's changed in details. And in the Middle Ages, they obviously added things like rose water in the Middle East. So you always have rose water in it. And you have pulses, lots of pulses, whatever you can, you know, broad beans and black-eyed peas and chickpeas, and also the beans, the kidney beans. And also you have lots of dried fruit in the Ottoman version. You have a lot of dried fruit. And this is a modern one. I just took this from the internet, actually, this picture. This is very typical with the fruit on top as well as in it, and with the pomegranate kernels. And the interesting thing also about wheat is that in Islamic belief, wheat was the forbidden tree of the Garden of Eden, not the fig or fruits. And when you sort of think about it, in fact, it makes a lot of sense, because wheat transformed people's lives. So you were hunter-gatherers, happily just gathering things in God's garden, and everything was just around you, just picked or trapped an animal. And then people started farming, and wheat was the main that was what really started the farming revolution. And so everybody's lives changed. And so when they say that the wheat was the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, it's sort of like an allegory about the beginning of the Neolithic age, when people's lives changed so completely and they stopped relying on God to supply them and they started growing their own. So it sort of has a lot of sense, in fact, in human history terms, much more than, say, the fig, which is wonderful, but you can't live on it. And this Ashure has a lot of symbolic significance. So it's today in Turkey, it's eaten on the 10th, mainly the 10th of Muharrem, which is the first month of the Islamic year, and neighbours make it. At one time I used to make a lot too, so you exchange little bowls of your Ashure with all your neighbours in your block of flats. But it's quite hard work making so much of it. You don't get any left to eat yourself. But of course you get their versions back. And so that's the Sunni. They do it, and then there's this story about it being invented by Noah in the Ark. But in fact, it goes back to much earlier traditions. In Muharrem, so the Alevis they fast, and they also make Ashure, but they do it as a gesture of mourning for Hussein, who was killed at the Battle of Karbala. So many stories around it, and they're all different. And this is just before we leave the Ashure. This is a recipe for how Ashure was made in 1870 by the mother of Sultan Abdulaziz, and she distributed it to all the people around her in the palace, and perhaps the poor as well. We don't really know exactly who, but it must have been thousands of people, because she was using 1.5 tons of dried ingredients. So if you think that all these beans and chickpeas need soaking in water, and it's quite a sloppy sort of dish, it must have made, I sort of calculated, it came to between 4 and 5 tons. So that would make an awful lot, even if you gave everybody quite a big sort of jugful, say. And hers contained wheat, broad beans, black eye beans, kidney beans, chickpeas, raisins, dates, hazelnuts, almonds, pine nuts, sugar, musk, rose water, clarified butter, rice flour and starch. And it's very tasty. If you haven't tasted it, it may sound funny, having a sweet dish with chickpeas and beans, but in fact, it's really very nice. If you ever go to Turkey and go and taste it in a good, cake shop or something, it's really worth trying. And this is another sort of pudding, soft pudding, called Zerde, and Zer is Persian, it means gold. So it's for the colour, and of course yellow has apparently, what I read, it's always been a celebratory colour. So this dish was, you had to have it at a wedding or a circumcision, and often you ate it, so you had a pilau, rice pilau, and then they heaped some of this on top, which you can see on the right, which is a 1582 miniature, and you can see these dishes, which are pilau, rice pilau, with the Zerde pudding heaped on top, and these are the Janissary soldiers waiting to have their feast, and they've also got whole roast lamb on these platters on the tripod, so that's their special feast to celebrate the occasion. And so this is also a very ancient dish, and they still eat it in Iran, as far as I know, nowhere else. Apparently not in Lebanon or Syria. And this was also on Friday nights at sort of soup kitchens, where you're feeding students and the poor and the people who work in the mosque. So that was also a Friday night treat, was this Zerde. And there's another kind, one on the left at the bottom is one I made, and it's made of melon. So instead of having water, it's just like a rice pudding, but without any, not made with milk, made with water, with some sugar, and coloured with saffron, and flavoured with saffron. But the one at the bottom, instead of that, you crush melon, and you cook that, the crushed melon, with the rice. And apparently this was popular in Diyarbakir and Beypazarı in the 17th century. So I wanted to experiment, and I'm sure a good cook could have, you know, created something even better, but it was very nice. And that's a lost dish, in fact. Nobody makes it except for a sort of historical dinner with somebody.
What's on the top, the black?
Oh, there, you sprinkle currants, and they've put pine nuts. In fact, this is a photo I found on the internet, but in fact, usually people just put currants and pine nuts on the top is the most common. They've also put some strands of saffron, which looks very nice. It's very tasty, but also, if you don't like saffron, which I don't actually, some people don't like it, I don't like the flavour of saffron, you can use turmeric instead. And then the next one we have, this is, you know, the famous baklava, everybody knows, and this is a picture from probably the mid-17th century, and it shows two Janissary soldiers carrying a tray of baklava on the 15th of Ramazan that was made at the palace. So on the 15th of Ramazan every year, they had a big celebration at the palace, and the Janissary soldiers, sort of, I think about 10,000, the ones that were posted in stationed in Istanbul, and the palace kitchens made hundreds of trays of baklava, and each 10 soldiers were entitled to one tray. So these are the two soldiers from their sort of little squad. You know, squad's the right word for the 10 soldiers, and they're carrying it off. And that ceremony went on until the early 19th century, until it was abolished by Mahmud II. And Ramazan is the main. Baklava is very important in Ramazan. You know, you should have it in Ramazan. Offer it to your guests. But of course, any celebration, baklava suits the bill. And probably it originated in Central Asia, because there's records in the 11th century of very, very thin pastry which crumbled at a touch. And then they have, throughout Central Asia and throughout Turkey, they have these things called katmer, where it's a bit like a kind of puff pastry, but in a different way. So you roll out your pastry very thin, and then you just brush some melted butter over it, and you just keep folding, rolling out, folding, rolling out, folding, rolling out, and it ends up like puff pastry, and that's usually called katmer. So that's how baklava probably developed in the 15th century, from those kind of dishes. And there's a Turkish poet called Kaygusuz Abdal. He was a mystic who lived in Alanya. And one of his poems, he talks about baklava filled with lentils. And I thought probably that was probably a joke, I thought. And then, although in fact in later times there is a kind where you mash beans, because people liked baklava filled with cream, but of course if you fill it with cream and then put it in the oven, the cream of course spoils once it's got to a certain temperature. It just turns into a sort of liquid. So you can't cook the cream, so you had artificial creams, and one of them was like mashed beans. You make it with sugar, so it's like an artificial cream. So maybe, I thought, well, maybe the lentils could have been that sort of thing, or maybe it was just a joke. But in fact, I was talking in July to a food historian called Charles Perry, who knows a lot about, especially Arab cuisine, historical Arab cuisine, but also a lot about Turkish cuisine and Iranian cuisine. And he came across a recipe for baklava filled with lentil puree and sugar in a Safavid cookery book, 16th century. So it did exist. I haven't got the recipe with me, unfortunately, but anyway, so it has to be tried, I suppose. And the other things they put in it, like we're not used to today, was fresh cheese. So it was like cheesecake. And that's in the recipe books, and I've read it in Ottoman recipe books. But I asked people around, said, "Have you heard of baklava made with cheese?" And everybody said, "That's ridiculous. You know, we've never heard of it. We've never seen it. It can't be right. It must be wrong." And it was also served hot, which would make sense, of course, for cheese, because you know how cheese, when you melt cheese and it gets hard again, you've got a piece of leather, haven't you? So it was served hot. Anyway, and then time passed and nobody had heard of it. And then a few years ago I went to Urfa in the east of Turkey for a conference, and at the university they fed us a lunch, which wasn't very exciting, but what the pudding came, and it was a triangle pudding, a pastry. And I ate it, and it was hot baklava with cheese inside. And I said, so what's this? And then it turned out they don't call it baklava, they call it katmer, but actually it's just baklava with this fresh cheese baked inside it. It was so nice, really incredible. And then I found a teacher who says that when the ladies get together for sort of coffee mornings, you have to make this. That's the big thing in Urfa, you know, to give to your guests. And she gave me a recipe, and somebody helped me make it, because I'm not good at rolling out the pastry so thin. And it really is absolutely fantastic, I have to tell you. It's really good, really nice. And of course, then you put the syrup on it over again. And it was also a gift, so you gave gifts of baklava to your children's teacher at certain times of year, that kind of thing, or to your neighbours and things. And there's quite a sweet little story. There's a Turkish novelist called Hüseyin Rami Gürpınar. And I don't know when he died, 1960s probably. He was born in the late Ottoman period, and he writes very amusing, some of them a bit tragic, but some of them amusing, and very witty novels. And he wrote his autobiography, and he writes when he was 9, you know, they sort of encourage children to have a go at fasting. So you'd say, you know, just try it for one day kind of thing. And so his parents did that to him when he was 9. They said, you know, just try it for one day. And his grandmother promised him a silver coin for that day that he fasted to encourage him. And he pretended to fast, and everybody was very happy, and the grandmother told the neighbours, and they sent him a big tray of baklava as a present for his success at fasting for one day. But in fact he'd been down into the kitchen secretly and eaten meatballs and jam. So it was all a con, really, but anyway, he still got his silver coin. And so that was how he got his baklava. And then and this is Gullach, and this is a very nice pudding. I don't know whether you can buy Gullach in London, but they're starch wafers, and they're very, very thin, you see through, and they're just starch and water, in fact. Some of the recipes say egg white as well, but mainly the ones you buy in the shops, they're just very thin. Usually they're about that big, and they just crumble as you touch them, and you put them in layers, or you can sort of make sure you put them in warm milk with rose water and sugar, so you have this sort of very sort of not so sweet sort of syrup of milk and rose water, very nice. And then it softens, and then you can sort of make little sort of flower shapes, but I don't bother, I just make it in layers anyway. And it's very nice, very light milk pudding. But somebody asked me for a recipe for it in America, and they don't have these Gullach wafers. And so I used a 15th century recipe, and this is the one I made myself. And that's my pan. And actually it worked very well, except that it stuck very badly. And then I looked through that 15th century book again, and I thought this was very interesting. He says that you rub the pan with a hard-boiled yolk of egg first. I thought it sounded a bit weird, really, but anyway, so I hard-boiled an egg yolk, or hard-boiled an egg, and then took out the egg yolk, and I sort of wiped it over the pan and tipped away the little crumbs. And you know, it made it non-stick. Really, it's a very good tip. You know, if you want to make a non-stick pan, you haven't got one. It's really like magic. Yes, so that was something worth knowing, I thought. And these are two cartoons. I don't know if you've heard of the shadow play, which is Karagöz's shadow play. So there was a humorous magazine after Abdülhamid the second was autocrat.
Well, he was.
Yes, he was, but I think the times, you know, were very turbulent, so perhaps it was anyway, whatever. He was deposed, and immediately scores of comic magazines started coming out. I sort of read a list in a book by some American researcher, and the list of these magazines was incredible. You know, really literally scores of them, making because he hadn't allowed any, he'd had very tight censorship. So everybody, and this is one of those magazines, it's called Karagöz, and it's one of the longest lasting. And they have incredible stuff about food history in them, because actually the meanings are almost all of them, they're political. But they use these quite humble daily things to do with eating and cooking as sort of symbols for what they want to say politically. And but these, in fact, these two aren't like that. They're quite rare. They are about the food because it's Ramazan at the time. One's 1910 and one's 1914, but they're both Ramazan. And in the top left one, this is Karagöz, who's the main character in the shadow play, and he's done his Ramazan shopping. And his friend Hacivat, who is the, like Morecambe and Wise, so he's Morecambe and he's early Wise, and then he's carrying all the things that you would stock up for Ramazan. So he's got his Gullach, those wafers, in a paper packet tied with ribbon around on his chest. And he's carrying a basket full of jam, because jam was a big thing at Ramazan. You had to have all kinds of really nice jams that you sort of tasted. And then he's got the jar with a leather, probably a leather, sort of the big jar. That is clarified butter from Aleppo. And the sort of cylindrical thing, that is macaroni, which in fact had been eaten in Turkey since the late 18th century, because the Italians turned it into quite an industry, so it was being imported all over the place. So there was macaroni available in Istanbul and probably a lot of other places. And these are garlic sausage, sucuk, and this is pastırma, the pressed cured beef. And then this one is, again, this is a cellar. In this picture, there's a cellar of, again, Gullach wafers in packets on this basket on his back. And Karagöz is following him in a, what's that, Conan Doyle's chap? Sherlock Holmes. So he's in a Sherlock Holmes sort of detective outfit, following him. And Hacivat says, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Well, I'm following the chap who's selling the Gullach." And he says, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, "I'm waiting because the house that buys the Gullach is bound to have a really nice Ramazan evening meal, and I'm going to go there." Because these rich people, they had open house in Ramazan. Anybody could just turn up. You had to be very rich to afford it, of course, but you just had huge tables, and anybody who came, you didn't turn them away, and you had to feed them. That was your sort of proud, if you were rich enough to do that, you were proud to sort of feed so many people. So he's just hoping to go to a place that has a decent meal, because they're going to have Gullach. So that just shows how important the Gullach was for Ramazan. And then this is an iftar meal. It's by an artist called Hoca Ali Reza. And this is because you fasted all day, so but you didn't just sit down to a regular evening meal afterwards. You had this sort of little, little bits and pieces, just to sort of, slowly start off sort of breaking your fast. So you had olives, and you have soup, and you have little bits of jam, and cheese, you can see there. So you have a bit of bread, and you just nibble, and have water, of course. So you have a little meal like this, and you just nibble away. And then you go to the evening prayer. I think that's how it was. And so you have a little rest, and you have smoke, a pipe, and then you go back and you have a proper meal, with all the courses. So that's a picture of that with the jam. So the jam was important, but of course they're fruit preserves. They're not sort of mushy jam like we have in England. Not sort of puree, but always the fruit is supposed to be whole or in attractive sort of shapes. And this is again that Karagöz cartoon from the same, and it's right when the magazine began in 1909. And this is Ramazan again, but this has a political meaning this time. And this is a confectioner's shop, and Karagöz is acting as the confectioner, and his friend Hacivat has come. This is very interesting because it shows how people, if you didn't make them at home, which was actually disgusting, people looked down on you. So if you were a housewife and you didn't make your own jam, that was really despicable, and you were sort of, not very good housewife. But anyway, some people had to buy them from the shop, if I don't know,
various reasons. So Hacivat has come with his jars and he's buying jam. And he's dealing out, he's got all these different kinds of jams, but the names on these jars aren't names of jams, they're names of government departments. So it's some political, I don't really know what the ins and outs of it are, but he's attacking the government. And so, in fact, the jam, of course, has quite an old history, especially quince, sort of, quince jelly, because that jelly's on its own very easily. So that was an old jam, and also rose jam is very old. Mevlana mentions it. But in the Ottoman period, all of a sudden they have so many different kinds of jam. All of a sudden it sort of explodes. So you had jam, and I think it's something to do with you had a lot of sugar, and if you make jam with honey, the honey can be very overpowering. But if you can use mainly sugar or all sugar, then you can use very delicate fruits like lemon blossom, let's say, or jujubes, which have a very delicate flavour, and your flavour will come out because you're using sugar. Whereas if you'd used honey, or what poor people used grape syrup, which they still do in Muğla, you can still find in villages. They use pumpkin actually, and it's got a flavour. It's a bit, the flavour is very overpowering. But so all of a sudden they started making, so many kinds of jam. It's unbelievable from the 15th century onwards that whatever they could turn into jam, they did. So it's a sort of flowering of the jams, really. So they had sort of water. This is 1539, for example. They had watermelon, apple, cornelian cherry, aubergine, green walnut, carrot, green almond, sage gall. That's very interesting. It's a gall that grows on some varieties, some species of sage, and it looks like a little crunchy apple, and you can sort of just nibble it. Sort of acidic, and that you can make jam out of that. It's a bit fiddly, but it's very nice. I must say, it's got a wonderful sort of sage smell. But it's not. No, I mean, I think I'm the only person who's made it for the last 100 years, actually, and it was very nice. And quince blossom and Judas tree flower, for example. Yeah, I mean, it would be lovely, but you couldn't do that nowadays, could you? I mean, where would you find all those flowers? It would just be impossible. Well, maybe the quince blossom if you went to an orchard, perhaps. And like at Topkapı Palace, they had a special kitchen just for jam making. So this is sort of flowering of the jam, and then this is like, so you offered jam to guests, or you offered a kind of like fondant. You offered your fondant to your guests. So this is from the 17th century. Before that, you offered people coffee and afterwards sherbet, and then you perfumed them with a censer. But from the 17th century on, they added jam to it. So first you ate a piece of jam, and then they brought you a coffee, and then maybe if they were a rich family, you'd get sherbet as well. And so this is a tray. That tray belongs to a lady who lives in Antalya, and still there's a few families who still do that, and that's her tray with 3 different kinds of jams, and that special set. In fact, the fork is a new thing, because in the past it was more like a type of fondant, fruit fondants that they gave to people. But later on they used, like these rolls of Seville orange jam, for instance. So you had a fork as well, depending on which kind you chose. So every guest would take just one piece, and then this is a very pretty set. It's a jam serving set that I suppose there were very beautiful ones in the past, but that's quite very pretty. And then this is Akide. Actually, it's just boiled sweets, which sounds very boring these days, but at the time in the 16th century, when boiled sweets were sort of invented, and you found that, and they discovered you could make them all kinds of flavours, that was a really big thing. And the word Akide comes from Arabic, and in some Syrian dialect, this is something from that famous linguist, that Austrian linguist Ticci. It could mean grape syrup. But also it meant loyalty. So they sort of became the meaning loyalty in one Arabic dialect, and the meaning of syrup So they just started to give these sweets as a symbol of loyalty to the state. So the janissaries would offer it to some to the Sultan, some to the Grand Vizier, that sort of thing. It became quite a sort of ceremonial thing. Of course, now they're old-fashioned. Not many people can be bothered with them. Everyone wants chocolate, and they're a bit boring. These sort of, well, that's what people think, you know, these boiled sweets. But in the past, they were something very important. The fact that they were transparent and beautiful colours and flavours. And then this is donuts, of course, and they're called lokma in Turkish, and they're either little balls or they make them in rings. And these also have some symbolic significance, so you could give them to the teacher when your child started school. But the main thing today is these people are outside a mosque. And at first I didn't understand what was going on, but apparently when somebody dies in Western Turkey, especially the Aegean region, somebody dies, so they hire these donut makers, and they make huge, huge pans of these donuts, and any passerby who comes is given, they gave us, it's in a plastic bag actually, I suppose in the past, I don't know, perhaps on a plate, or you just ate them there, I'm not quite sure. And so they dole out, you know, just tons of this stuff, and it's in memory of the dead person. And this is, I found this on the internet, and it's a chap who's a tombstone maker and a donut maker at the same time. That shows how. So he's advertising his tombstones with the donuts underneath.
Well,
yeah, it's sort of interesting, and it shows how tied up it is for them. And the ones in Izmir are very famous. If you ever go to Izmir or Kuşadası, if you eat them in Istanbul, I don't like the ones they make in Istanbul, they're different, but you go to those places, the taste is just wonderful, really good donuts. They dip them in syrup. And, how am I going?
oh, all right.
Try hurry up and hurry a bit. Okay, this is the stuff that if you ate the little diamond shapes. And this is how it begins. It's very difficult, and it's amazing. In the past, they used to make it at home, and it was really, it is much harder to make this than to make baklava. Much harder. Gosh. It is really a tremendous skill, and you can't believe that people just made it in their own homes, because first you have to boil the sugar to the right, exactly the right consistency and temperature, which is something, a skill in itself. And then you have to just let it cool down a bit, and then you have to pull it, and it turns white. And this old chap called Mehmet Veren, unfortunately he got Alzheimer's. I was going to ask him to go, I wanted to go and ask him to make it again and film it, and very sadly. And he was the one in the family who knew how to make it really well. And you can see how proud he is. It's so sweet. His grandson took this photo, and he was very proud, because it's really a difficult thing to do, to get it right. And so that's him pulling the sugar, and then that's his son and daughter-in-law, and then meanwhile the flour has been roasted in butter. So that's that sort of floury stuff there, and then you put your ring of the boiled sugar, and you start sort of at least three people have to do it, and it's very skillful. You know, you must, because if you pull too hard and break it, the whole thing's wasted. You have to throw it in the dustbin. So they gradually, of course, it's quite hot. So as you sort of go like that and do like that, it becomes bigger. So and gradually the flour is absorbed. So when it's the size of the tray, you make a figure of 8, flop it over, again it's small, and again you do it, and then you turn it over again, and again you do it. So first you've got 1 strand, then you double it, the figure of 8, you've got 2 strands, then 4 strands, then 6 strands. And then I wrote an article about this for a magazine once, and the girl at the magazine, the editor, she said, and I thought, how many strands could there be after doing it, say, 40 times? And I thought, must be a lot, because every time you double, you very quickly get over to more than 1,000. And I sort of said, well, about 10,000. She phoned me up and she said, I'm sure you've got it wrong. It can't possibly be 10,000. That's just such a huge number. And my brother-in-law is a physics professor, and he happened to be visiting us. And I don't know how to do that calculation up to 40 times automatically, but of course he's a professor, he knows it. So I said, Ajahn, can you work out how many strands there would be after 40 times? And the result is, this is, you know, the professional saying it, 1,099,511,000,000 strands. That's 40 times, and a lot of people, they do it 45. So that stuff that you ate there is probably 45. So that's why it's like sort of thistledown. If you're the ones who tasted it, it sort of just sort of disappears in your mouth. And so it's really very interesting that this, and so it's a very delicate thing to do, and you mustn't break it. And they made it anyway. And but it's dying out. There's very few people do it at home now, unfortunately. And it's really, I would like to learn it properly, but anyway. And this was a village near Alanya in the Taurus Mountains. And in this village, they say that they learnt to make this stuff out of honey. So that shows that it's very ancient, because everywhere else is using sugar. But these people were originally a nomadic village, and seasonal nomadic, moving into the mountains every summer, and they used only honey. So that shows that it's very ancient. And the village legend is that the founder of the village was a mystic scholar called Pirce, what was his name? Pirce Aladdin, and he founded the village in the 13th century. He came along with Mevlana at that time from Khorasan in eastern Persia, and brought this with him. And they still make it of honey, and I watched them. It was very interesting. And here again, it's an old lady. That old lady, they called her the Grand Master, and everybody did what she told them. And these younger women, they couldn't make it without her. So I don't know how long that village is going to carry on making it. And the sherbet is interesting because actually sherbet is in fact a fruit drink, you know, made with lemons or oranges and sweetened. So it's a summer drink, and especially in a culture where alcohol was frowned on, you had to do it quite secretly in your own home. So soft drinks were very important in old Turkish culture, and they used to have these ready-made, because like cherries have a short season, so when things came into season, so that you could make different varieties throughout the year, you used the fruit juice and sugar, and they made these sort of slabs of sort of crunchy stuff, and you could keep it, you see, so that when your visitor came, you just had to mix a bit up in a glass, and hey presto, you could offer your visitors some whatever kind of sherbet you wanted. And then the Italians started to drink this and heard of it, and Duke Francisco de Medici, he heard of it, and in 1577 he asked for a recipe for the Turkish sherbet. And then it spread to France and then to England, and in England it became very popular. In the 17th century, they were selling it in cafes, which were new. Sort of a new thing from Turkey, the cafe, like there was in London and I think Oxford as well. But then it became expensive. You have real fruit juice, it's expensive. So they started making it with citric acid and tartaric acid, that sort of thing. And gradually it turned into these, common English sweets, which are just made of, citric acid and artificial flavourings. But they're still popular, and that's why they're called sherbet. So it's sort of interesting the way it sort of evolved and changed. And then this is a kind of toffee originally it was made of tons of expensive spices, but I think today it's basically cloves and cinnamon and sugar. And then on the first day of the ancient Persian New Year, called Nevruz, they throw them to the crowds below in Manisa. They still do it every year. Apparently it's been going on since the 16th century. And there was a version of this that they used to sell outside schools, but yes, you remember it. I missed it, unfortunately, in the days, because my daughter said, "Oh, haven't you seen them? We used to have it when we came out of school." And I'm so sorry that I missed the real thing, but there you are. And this these are the lollipops, which are very interesting. In fact, they were made in England and a lot in America. But I've asked quite a lot of people, sort of food experts, and they think, it must have gone from the Middle East. so what these are, they're hollow lollipops, and this is one here. And they're made in a double mould, and they're called cockerel sweets because that was the most famous shape. So usually they're in the shape of a cockerel, and they also have a whistling kind. So let me just pop down there. Did I put a whistle? Oh no, I forgot. Anyway, but this is a whistling kind. Yeah. And it's a sugar whistle, and he makes them in a special mould with sort of 5 little spaces and a nail to make the thing in the middle. Apparently it's a little bit fiddly because you have to cut out the air hole, and I think they're fun. I'm trying to sort of keep them. There's 2 chaps in the whole of Turkey now who make them. They used to have them in every single neighbourhood. There would be a chap making these at home and selling them in the street to children, but now sadly only 2 left, and one of them in Bergamo near Izmir. And this is the chap in Bergamo who still makes them. He's a Romani, and he's still making. He doesn't make the ones with whistles. He says it's too fiddly. He says he has trouble selling these because all the children want chocolate, but he makes them in his sitting room, and his wife helps him, and then he goes out and sells them at weddings or to tourists around Pergamon. And this is the other chap who still makes them in Bursa, and he still makes them with the whistles. So this is one that he made with the whistles. But the other chap has more interesting moulds. His moulds are quite nice, but he puts the whistle on, which is lovely. And this I discovered only in December, I think it was, and it's in Manchester University, the Rylands Library, and it is a picture of a man selling lollipops in the shape of birds in 1660, and he's put them into an upside down bottle gourd with holes in it. In fact, I had one made. I bought a bottle gourd shaped like that and had holes made in it, but I couldn't fit it in the suitcase. Anyway, these kind of albums with pictures were made for tourists who went to Turkey from the 17th century onwards, and this is obviously made for a Dutch person, and in Dutch, apparently, it writes little birds made of sugar. Yeah. So, and this is the sucuk. I don't know whether you tasted that. You know, it's that sort of, they're on strings. It's a bit sticky. They make them in different parts of the country in different ways. There's lots of varieties, so they make them everywhere. Sometimes they make mulberry juice, mostly grape juice. Sometimes they use other nuts except for walnuts. This is Gaziantep. There's the Malatya. Now they all have a different look, and I tried making it at home. Mine don't look too wonderful, but yeah, just to see how it worked out. And this is, they're called Rosette fritters. I don't know if you've come across them, because whoever I talk to, they've eaten them in Hong Kong or Sweden or America or Italy or Morocco. Anyway, they're made, they must be a very ancient thing to have spread so far. So who knows where they began. But they're still made in a few places in Turkey. And you have a batter like pancake batter, and then you have a hot pan of fat, so you dip your mould. These are modern moulds made in Erzurum in eastern Turkey. So you dip your mould. Actually, I have some very nice antique ones, more interesting than these. But anyway, you can make any shape you want. So you dip them into the hot fat until they're really hot, and then you dip them into your pancake batter, and then you dip them back into the hot fat, and within a second you've got a pretty, very light, and fritter, and then you take them out. You either put syrup on them or you can sprinkle icing sugar. And these are all the places where it is still made in Turkey now, although it's really dying out. But in Erzurum, they really think these things belong to them. And this lady who writes a cookery book, she wants to have this geographical indication for Erzurum. And she's so determined that they all started in Erzurum and they belong there. But who knows? So nobody knows where they began, because they're all over the world. In Spain, Mexico, it's amazing, with different names. And this is a village where they make them for engagement parties. and they have several different. This family was using 5 different bowls, and that was them making it on outdoor fire to show us. That's it. That was the end.
Well, whoever will be brave enough to try Pişmaniye, perhaps? Well, with great difficulty. Any questions? Gullach?
Would you be able to tell us the simple ingredients of a sherbet served to a roast when visit a lady who was given birth? Lohusa sherbet.
Oh, lohusa sherbet.
Lohusa sherbet.
No, yes, the one I showed was lohusa sherbet. It's red. Yeah, it's just sugar and spices, cinnamon and cloves are what I remember, and red colouring. I suppose I don't know what the red colouring would have been in the past, but I suppose the red was sort of a joyous colour. And it's just sugar, and they somehow cook it so that you end up with a slab, so that it doesn't. So it's a crystallised sort of chunk. Yes, and then you melt. So you have your visitors when you've had a baby. So you pour boiling water on one of those sort of square tablets, and then you make a jug of it, and you offer all your guests a glass each.
You mentioned initially that the cane sugar came from Persia. Obviously, huge amounts were used in the Ottoman period.
Yes.
Was there a big sort of cane sugar growing and refining industry in Anatolia?
I think it was grown very little because because it does grow and it could have grown, but of course it was mainly Damascus and a part of Iran. There's a very famous place famous for its sugar in Iran. Of course, Egypt became the big place. But before that, of course, sugarcane has an earlier history. Before it got to Persia, I think it came from New Guinea, I think they say, originally, with this genetic sort of things they can do nowadays. And then it went to India, and gradually this refining built up. But it was the Persians who sort of perfected it. So for Turkey, it was actually Egypt was the big supply, Egypt and Damascus.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Did the minorities in Turkey, like the Greeks and Armenians, have their own dessert culture, shall we say?
Yes, to some extent, but on the whole, everybody sort of was sharing and eating the same things. But when it came to religion, then you varied. Like the Armenians and the Greeks, they have a different variety of this wheat pudding, which would make sense because, of course, it's a very ancient pudding. So, like I haven't eaten the Greek one, but lots of people described it to me. It's dry. So instead of being a soft sort of swishy pudding like the Turks make it, they boil the wheat and it's like sort of soft but dry. They haven't got a liquid with it. And then they decorate it with all kinds of sort of, a silver gold leaf and anything, all kinds of things they sort of decorate and make a plate. So it's a sort of a dry thing. And the Armenian one is also slightly different, and it's called, anyway, I can't remember it, Ganush, or something like that, and it's slightly different too. So when it comes to religion, then you get a lot of differences, or some differences at least. So they have those, like, I think they eat it on All Souls, when funerals, I think the Greeks have it. I'm not quite sure. I think the Armenians at New Year, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned the baklava with cheese.
Yes.
You didn't mention künefe at all. Is that an
No.
Arabic?
Well, yeah, that's also, of course, very similar. Yes, it's just that's the tel kadayif with the cheese
Yeah.
inside. But everybody can eat künefe everywhere now, especially. But nobody remembers the baklava, which is sort of sad. But it's the same, exactly the same principle and hot. Yes, and that's very nice too,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yes, we like that.
Lynette?
Do you know the origin of the pişmaniye? I've not had it
Yeah,
before.
well,
It's
it's
delicious.
yes, it is delicious, isn't it? That one particularly, because I went to Eminönü. I usually go to. I went to Eminönü on the that side of Istanbul, and I went to the famous Hacı Bekir and another shop, and I tasted 3 kinds, and they were all, if you ask me, inedible.
Well, where did you get it?
Yeah, because they're doing it commercially and they're not using butter. They're using, unfortunately, some sort of very bad quality margarine. And you don't. So if you eat that, you won't like it. Whereas you eat this and it's got made with butter, the very traditional way, and it's really nice. Some pishmaniers are nice. They're a little bit thicker strands, and it comes from the original comes from Persia because it's Peshem means wool, so it was called pashmak, and in Turkish it became called pishmaniye or peshmek.
And where did you actually find that in the end?
Well, the place that makes, these were the people who first took it out of homemaking and built a factory to make it in the 1950s. These were the first people to do it. Everybody copied them and used bad ingredients. This is a company in Mudurnu, and I ordered it straight from them because they can't compete, unfortunately, because everybody copied their packaging and everything and the name. So there's all these copies around, but yes, it's sort of rather sad, really. I can't really tell you anywhere in Istanbul where you could guarantee getting that one.
Thank you for taking the trouble to bring it, because it's a heck of a benchmark. Because that really
It is. It's really nice, isn't it? Unfortunately, it's very sensitive, so it hasn't got a long shelf life. Apparently they were exporting at one time, and they said it just didn't work because it didn't have a long enough shelf life.
So it's Mudurnu near Bolu?
Yes, near Bolu. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to get their kind in Istanbul. I said, why don't you just start from scratch, make a completely new box and sell it for more, because yours is such good quality, yours is decent ingredients. Sell it for a bit more, so that everybody knows that it's not just some sort of cheap stuff. But anyway.
So you can get it in Mudurnu?
In Mudurnu,
You can
yes.
get it. Okay.
Yes, I ordered it over the phone.
I coming from Sarajevo, from Bosnia, and I'm very familiar with this food.
Yes.
I cook some of them.
Ah, which
I
ones?
cook everything.
Oh,
Almost
really?
everything. But Ashure is very interesting because Ashure in Bosnian Islam have one day when people eat this. I can't remember now which is exactly. This is in Islam mythology. And all year women collect ingredients. They must be, I think so, is 66, 68 is different. But collect this and make 7 days this Ashure. For this, I think so they are maybe some battle somewhere, or when Prophet Muhammad comes somewhere. I don't know, it's 1 day only when people eat this, and must be, in Sarajevo is 66 different different ingredients.
Do you use the internet? Would you
that's and I read my mother was curator in museum in Sarajevo, and director of this museum, Akide, wrote beautiful article about Ashure in Bosnia, which is printed in Croatia in one Croatian ethnological magazine.
Oh, that's
I
very
read this. They are very interesting.
Yeah.
Second is baklava. We make baklava very different, and one is with dried plums.
Yes. What kind of dried plants?
Dried plums.
Oh, dried plums. Really,
Dried
that's
plums,
interesting.
yes.
Oh, I see. So it's sort of very interesting because it's a bit like the strudel,
plums.
isn't it? Apple strudel. So
The women make this mostly when is month of Ramadan.
yes.
Sometime, no, or for Bayram.
Yes.
One or another. And also is interesting how people make this cheteni, this, because people do this during winter.
They what?
Cheteni halva.
Which one?
How you call this exactly? Chetenia, we call it in Bosnia chetenia. This which you
Stretch.
from sugar.
Oh, the the pishmaniye. Yes.
Cheteni halva.
Or pulled sugar.
No, yeah. How you call this? How is
The keten helva.
Cheten halva.
Yeah. Oh,
People
yes.
do this
Oh,
only.
so you're.
People do this only during winter.
Yes. Yes.
They
Exactly.
They
Yes.
use because outside is maybe minus 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and everything, and inside they cook. Outside come and make this this caramelization. How
Yes,
can
I
call
heard
it.
that for Sivas.
And we children, we sit down and look and wait. Chetenia be or not to be. That's the most interesting. will be or not to be.
Oh, that's wonderful. Can I give you my card? We can correspond because I haven't got time to.
I coming here always. I know you very well.
Yes. That's fantastic.
And they are Bosnian cookbook, which is in English now.
Oh,
also.
really?
And excellent. Dr. Lamia Hadji Osmanovic wrote this. She's a professor of Turkish language
Yes.
in Sarajevo, and she wrote this, and it is translated in English and in English, and they are all this. And what I miss in this book are color photos,
Yes.
because color is all this food, Oriental food, Ottoman food, isn't only food, is ceremony, everything,
Yes.
everything, and this is process of cooking and everything is important, like eating. Eating is something when this disappears.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I have to get that book. Thank you very much. That's really fantastic information.
I think there's another gentleman.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Tariq. I
Yes.
interesting lecture. I am originally from Pakistan.
Yes.
India and Pakistan continent has very strong and
Yeah.
beautiful traditions in sweets and
Yeah, very
spicy
similar,
foods.
aren't they?
So what do you think both Turkish and Indian food and sweets does have any interrelation or experience?
I'm sure very much. I'm sure via Persia.
Yeah.
And people were coming and going and trading. There's huge similarities. I ate a Pakistani meal in Ankara many years ago, and it was just like a Turkish meal.
Yeah.
So there's so many shared features. It was semolina helva they had. Yes, irmik helva they had. I can't remember offhand now, but the things they were very, very similar. Yes, a shared culture. Yes.
The sweet candies like gajar, vagara, very nice.
Yes.
You shown Bissell sweets, they are still same tradition in our country. Punjab.
Is there a good book about Pakistani sweets and
Yes.
confectionery?
Have you anything about how you make tirit for baklava? Do you know what is tirit?
I know what is tirit, but for baklava that sounds very strange.
What is tirit?
Well, tirit is when you take dried bread and you dip it in meat juice and then you put it.
That's right. So you're not tirit.
This is something different. So, well, how do you make it?
I don't know. They make with the flour and water and everything, and they eat all this sugar water. When you put sugar water, they eat sugar water. Sugar water isn't outside. If you eat baklava is like dried,
Yeah.
but is full of sugar.
Yes.
They are tirit. You make this tirit. We buy now tirit, but tirit
Really?
was originally. I remember when my grandmother made it.
Is it in that cookbook you mentioned?
I think so.
Ah. What's her surname? That professor who wrote
I
the
will tell
cookbook.
you.
Okay.
Now, may I remind you that we have copies of this wonderful book for sale, and behind you there, at Naomi, is it £10? £10 a copy. Wonderful value. Any other questions or? Okay, can we thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for inviting us. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That was wonderful. It was a great honor to have you here.